All right, grade seven. So we are going to be working into a concept of poetry for the next little while in language arts. So I thought that I would start by going over the slides that I would have been giving you guys in class as your notes. I will be posting this, of course, to the Google Classroom, in which case you guys can be watching it and going through it along with me or look through it on your own. So poetry for grade seven, the kinds of things that you're going to need to know. Now, one of the first things you're going to need to know, um, poetry can be defined as the expression of emotion and descriptive or narrative elements consisting of a specific structure and employing figurative language to create an effect. That's one definition. Another definition of poetry is expressive writing in a form. That's the easiest definition I can provide you with. You've got to bear in mind that poetry is going to use things to be effective in its expressions. Um, Now, purpose. Students often wonder about why they have to study or write poetry. Why do you think this is? Do you think it is to torture and subject students to unusual and cruel torments? Is it to show students things that have already been done and should never again be attempted? Or is it to introduce students to a new and different means of expression? If you chose A, no. As much as you might feel that sometimes these things are torture, it is not for you. It is not also to show you things that have already been done. Although many of these things have been done, they should be attempted again. It is because you guys need to see different ways of expressing yourselves. Poetry has a plethora. There's a new word for you. A plethora is a large number. So poetry has a large number of different forms. Different writers have experimented with different ways of expressing themselves, and some writers adhere to following specific conventions, while others have preferred to experiment with unusual constructions or with unique formats. Each form is used for a different reason. Now, there are two primary aspects to poetry we will look at this year: poetry creation or construction, and poetry analysis or appreciation. Yes, I'm going to be asking you guys to probably write some poetry. It's really okay, honest. Both aspects are important to this course and to an understanding of poetry in general. Um, Constructing poetry or creating poetry requires that you understand exactly what your goals of the writing are. How you want to express your views, and a recognition of the techniques that you've got at your disposal. Poetry creation is often a more effective way of self expression than prose forms because it requires less attention to structure and to audience than essays or short stories. You don't have to worry about how you've put things together quite as much in poetry as you do in a story or an essay. Also, the spelling conventions are kind of less important as are punctuation concerns. Poetry analysis is the process for understanding the poetry of other people. It is, however, necessary foundation for poetry construction. Knowing what forms you may employ and recognizing how the use of poetic technique can influence your writing is a key in writing good poetry. In other words, if you want to write good poetry, you have to understand good poetry and what makes poetry good. If you don't have that base understanding, if you can't look at a poem, break it down, consider it, you're probably not going to write the greatest poetry, and you might not be able to express yourself as thoroughly as you would like to. So, being able to analyze poetry is important in helping you construct poetry. It requires you to have spent some time looking at the poem. It is difficult to develop an understanding of a poem on first glance. Before you try and do anything else, you want to be sure you understand what the poem is about. To do this, you have to determine what kind of poem it is. Additionally, at the very end of all of this, I have something called a five-step poetry analysis process. Now, that five-step analysis process gives you a five-step approach to every poem you can look at that will help you come to a complete and thorough understanding of the poem. Now, of course, it is a in-depth poetry analysis structure, and so uh, doing it on long poetry is time consuming, and that's okay. Unless I'm mistaken, you guys are sitting at home um, all day long, and so you got some time on your hands. Spend it. It's okay. So, types of poems. There are many types of poems we will look at in this unit, but principally we're going to be looking at narrative poems, or poems that tell a story, descriptive poems, or poems that describe an emotion or a specific object, and we might take a look at some abstract or shape poems as well. Narrative poems. These poems tell a story. They follow the same kinds of guidelines as a short story, including plot, complications, climax, resolution, all those things along the way. Narrative poems, they can be about major events like wars or love, or they can be about a cat crossing the street. The topic of the narrative poem is as individual as the poet itself, and it's important to note that narrative poems can use descriptive elements. Descriptive poems describe something. It can be a reaction to an event, a personal emotion, a lovely object, anything else words can describe. They sometimes use narrative techniques, but they don't have to. It's secondary. And then abstract poems, they don't fall within the confines of the other styles. They may be shape poems. They may take the form of something. They may use specific letters, like acrostic poems. There are tons of different types of poetry. And recognizing that you can't confine it into one style is really, really important. Poetic devices. Second step in understanding a poem is getting an understanding of how the poet is attempting to convey their message. These are also termed as figurative language, poetic terms, poetic techniques, among other things. Ultimately, poetic devices are methods the poet uses to stimulate the reader's senses through the use of words or through association to other things. Now, let's take a quick look at those things. This is, while it's not a total list of poetic devices, this is a pretty solid list of poetic terms or devices. So, memorize it. That's simple. Learn these phrases, learn these terms, figure out what these things are. And I need you to realize that you'll need to know these things for the next 5 years of school. That's simple. You're going to need to know and understand what all these things are all the way up to grade 12. So spend the time now so you're not asking yourself in 3 years, what does alliteration mean? Because your teacher will be frustrated. You will be frustrated. Your parents will be frustrated. And you know that it's just going to take a question of spending some time now, doing some flashcards, figuring it out, remembering it. Okay, so that's on you. Alliteration, allusion, hyperbole. No, not hyperbole, hyperbole. Metaphor, onomatopoeia. I know it's a weird spelling, but it's kind of a cool word. Personification, simile, and oxymoron. One of the favorite terms for most students. Not used that often, but it's kind of a cool term. So these are the poetic devices that I'm going to expect you guys to know. I'm going to stop this before it gets too long as a video. Memorize this list.